because whether it's in Washington, as we just talked about, driving inflation with overspending and overtaxing and debt issues, or it's at the state or local level, taxes equal spending. And of course, that's at the end of the day, how you get taxes down over the long term is you limit government spending and you get back to those core functions of government.
429 on the Tim Jones and Chris Arps Show. And as advertised on the line, Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, as we like to call it. Jonathan, welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks so much. And as always, greetings from the land of make-believe out here in Washington.
Excellent. Well, you heard that clip there about wages were up 4.5%. I think they said. Also, 353,000 jobs were created in January. Is it happy times here in America again, Jonathan?
Well, it sounds great. And we all want it to be happy times. I don't think it's the case quite yet, right? I mean, that we've had coming in throughout the Biden administration, we've seen record inflation that has eaten away at those wage gains. And so while the nominal number may look good in some of these reporting periods, let's not forget the real number. Real wage growth has actually been negative during the Biden administration after very strong gains during the Trump years. And so this is something that oftentimes gets neglected by the mainstream media and certainly by those that are paid to give the spin on these type of issues. But it's really important to look into the real effect of wages, which is after inflation. And of course, then the other way to look at it, of course, is after tax returns and wages. And so these are all really important pieces to consider as we see those top line numbers. And so, it's the other thing to keep in mind, Chris, is a lot of these numbers on the job numbers or even GDP numbers that we've seen initial reports to be fairly positive. There's been a long track record now over the last year or so that these numbers get revised downward after the fact. And so there's all this fanfare over these positive job numbers and GDP numbers, and let's all hope they are accurate. But the track record is not very good, and the numbers have been revised downward. And of course, that doesn't catch any kind of mainstream media highlight when that gets revised into a more realistic space.
Yeah, you'd almost think they were cooking the books. Jonathan, great to speak with you again. And I wanted to highlight for our audience the fact that you and your colleague Nick Stark over at ALEC have a great new article up at the Daily Caller. It's called Good Things Happen to States That Cut Taxes. So, Jonathan, I think it's so important that you and Nick wrote this article because, the first battle was trying to convince as many of the 50 laboratories of democracy as possible to cut taxes in the first place. And so many of them have. And we've really got a battle going on between the 50 laboratories, between the states that are cutting taxes, the states that are raising taxes or keeping high taxes in place, and then the states that are doing nothing at all. So a lot of that has happened over the last decade or more. And so now I know you and Nick and others at ALEC are looking at the results. Jonathan, 35,000 foot look at this. What is happening in the states that are cutting taxes versus those that aren't?
Well, it's going to be no shocker, Tim, and good to talk with you as always, that the states that are cutting taxes, and there's about half of our states in the last 3 years coming out of COVID that have substantially cut their tax rates on personal and business income, especially. And you compare those 25 states with the 25 states that have not cut taxes. And then, of course, you take the extremes of the states that have been the most aggressive on tax cuts versus those that have been the most aggressive on tax increases, such as California and New York. And as you say, across the laboratories of democracy, it couldn't be more clear that this is the way that states have really sorted themselves out. Is there going to be a philosophy of keeping government limited and keeping taxes low and trying to reduce the cost of living in those states? Or are they going to take the approach of how do we continue to feed big government spending plans? And so I think it's awfully clear. We saw the new census data that came out just before the new year, where hundreds of thousands of Americans are leaving places like California and New York, continued. And this is a trend now for 16 years that we've written about in rich states, poor states, and they continue to vote with their feet and go to states like Texas and Florida and Tennessee that value economic competition. And by the way, those three states, none of those states have an income tax. And that's one of the most important things that states are competing on. And so 25 states in the last 3 years. And just last year in 2023, we celebrated another 12 states cutting income tax rates because they know that is one of the most effective ways to produce job growth and produce a better and more prosperous economy for everyone.
Speaking with Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist at Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Jonathan, today this week, the Fed's monetary policymakers kept rates unchanged for their first meeting of the year. Is this the right direction for the economy to keep it strong or keep it growing?
Well, I think it's clear that the Federal Reserve and others, know that I don't think inflation is quite in the rearview mirror yet. This is still a threat because of the continued appetite for big government spending and just the massive amount of new debt and new spending we continue to add to this pile of debt that we already had pre-pandemic as a nation, and now crossing the Rubicon of $34 trillion of national debt. We're not out of the woods yet when it comes to inflation. And I think that's a important recognition by the Federal Reserve that we cannot go onto a rate cutting spree quite yet, given that the numbers are coming in, whether they're artificially high or not, on job creation and GDP, and you add that to the overall level of debt. We're paying $1 trillion+ in just to service the debt and interest payments that are not going to pay for Social Security and other key government programs. They're going just to pay the debt that we've accrued. And so I don't think we're out of the woods yet by any stretch of the imagination. And we need to get a handle on the culprit for this inflation causing high interest rates, and that is overspending in Washington, D.C.
Speaking to Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist, Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Jonathan, as states are cutting taxes, which is such a great thing, and as you've shown in the data that ALEC puts together every year, in the rich states, poor states that you assemble with Dr. Art Laffer and Stephen Moore and so many of your staff, we see that those states are growing. People are moving out of the high tax, high regulation states into the lower tax, lower regulation states. But Jonathan, states also, as they're cutting taxes, they need to make sure that they're keeping their spending in check as well. And we saw a big victory in Colorado, which has become, unfortunately, a really blue state. But the people there haven't completely lost their minds because they protected their taxpayer Bill of Rights provision this year. And Jonathan, as all the COVID cash and the Biden bucks kind of work their way completely now through the system, many states may be faced with some budget deficits. So as they're cutting taxes, they also need to prioritize what is the proper role of government spending too, don't they?
Well, you hit the nail on the head, Tim, and that is exactly the message that we've been giving to state legislators for well more than a decade now, which is, we absolutely should cut taxes to make your state more competitive and increase population and job growth and all of the virtuous things that come with being a state that has a lower cost of doing business and living. But you need to match that with the real spending restraint that you talk about, whether you adopt a spending limit in your state constitution, like Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights that you mentioned, that is, I think, the gold standard of state spending limits, or you have the right folks that have the gavels in your budget committees in your states across the country looking to keep the lid on spending growth, because whether it's in Washington, as we just talked about, driving inflation with overspending and overtaxing and debt issues, or it's at the state or local level, taxes equal spending. And of course, that's at the end of the day, how you get taxes down over the long term is you limit government spending and you get back to those core functions of government. What does government exist to provide for the citizens, right? What does it need to do those core functions that otherwise couldn't be provided by individuals and businesses and civic institutions and churches and synagogues across the United States? And so I think that's the core question for policymakers. But, it's not just states that are cutting taxes that are having a downturn potentially and facing budget deficits. It is the states that have raised taxes, ironically. They've hit the Laffer curve where you raise taxes and you still get budget deficits. And that's, of course, the case study of California, generally referred to as a state which to not emulate, right? The state that just always gives us the path of how you do things incorrectly. California has the highest taxes in America, and as reported earlier this year, we're facing upwards of a 50 or $60 billion budget shortfall, even with all the Biden bucks. But as those federal dollars go away, Tim, this is going to be even more important for states across the country. These were one-time dollars. We always knew they were one-time dollars, but a lot of times state legislators that have not been ALEC members, have not been principled out there, have treated them that they were going to be around for the long term. And of course, that's not the case. We saw that during the Obama years. that is the recipe for state really fiscal problems. And I think we're going to see a lot of calls, especially in the states that have not been responsible, to increase taxes here in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, education reform, school choice has really been a hot button issue across the United States. We've been seeing a lot of states enacting that. We have a measure right now going through the Missouri legislature. ALEC has announced the launch of an Education Freedom Alliance. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's really one of the most exciting things this year so far that I've seen, and that's we've been partnering with our good friend Steve Moore, who works with us on our Rich States, Poor States project, and Alfredo Ortiz at the Job Creators Network, and many, many groups all across the country that stand for empowering parents and empowering children to make the decisions that are best for their education situations. And we've seen, as good as the tax cut revolution over the last several years at the state level has been, we've seen an incredible movement for parental empowerment and school choice, education freedom moving across the country, starting in West Virginia, Arizona, and then moving to states like Iowa and Arkansas. We've seen 10 states now in the last 3 years move to universal education freedom accounts for parents to choose public, private, charter, homeschool, any option that works best for their family. And I tell you what, doing this now for 20 years, gentlemen, this may be the thing that I'm proudest of, is being involved with this effort to really change the way that education is delivered to families and students across the country. Because what's clear is what doesn't work. And that, of course, is the status quo in so many cases, where we see these horror stories in Chicago or Baltimore or Detroit or here in Washington, D.C., where taxpayers are paying $20 or $30 or $35,000 per student per year to have horrible outcomes and to have kids not learning the basics of reading, writing, and math. That's just not acceptable in this modern age that we live in. And so it's clear we need innovation within education, and that's exactly what our Education Freedom Alliance is all about, is to bring these choices to families all across the country.
Jonathan, before we let you go, and it's been great speaking with you about tax freedom in the states and educational freedom in the states. ALEC does a lot on those issues, but ALEC does a lot on a lot of issues. 10 task forces at ALEC, and I know one of the things that we're all very proud of at ALEC is the fact that ALEC decided to step forth and make sure its position was known on the international, one of the top international relations issues of maybe our lifetimes, and that was asking state leaders to stand with Israel while condemning Hamas. You had a project on that as well. That's been incredibly successful all across the country, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, that's a great point, Tim, and that's another great example of ALEC legislators and members across the country really leading on an issue. I'm so proud to be a part of that effort as well. We've had several hundred now state legislators consider that letter and sign that letter condemning the violence and the terrorism from Hamas and standing with our friends and allies in Israel to stand to thwart this attack on their livelihoods and their very existence. And it's so important that state legislators can lend their voices to these important national and international issues such as these to stand up for really truth and what's happening now. And I think, it's something that really the letter continues to build as we speak. And so if state legislators are listening to this broadcast, we'd love to have additional names on our letter. We have Republicans and Democrats and independents across the board signing this ALEC letter condemning the violence of Hamas and protecting our friends in Israel. And so the important effort, and it's going to continue. And certainly our thoughts and prayers are to our friends in Israel that are really going through this horrendous situation.
We have been speaking with Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Thank you so much for joining us today. Jonathan, have a great weekend, and thank you for your efforts on behalf of Israel.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Have a great weekend. Always good to connect.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jonathan.